The terms direct and inverse are fundamental to Algonquian linguistics, but I'm not sure that we have a clear definition of what exactly these terms mean. Consider this pair of verb forms, which everyone would agree are direct and inverse. But why? Are direct and inverse the names of particular morphemes, the direct and inverse suffixes that appear on the verb? Or are they the names of particular agreement patterns, that is, particular ways of using agreement morphology, such as the use of the prefix to index the agent, as in I see her, or the patient, as in she sees me? Or are they the names of particular configurations of arguments? Direct means that a higher-ranked person acts on a lower-ranked person, and inverse means the opposite. I argue in this talk that the terms direct and inverse refer primarily to agreement patterns. They can also be used to denote particular morphemes, but they should not be used to denote particular configurations of arguments. Furthermore, I also argue that in addition to the direct and inverse agreement patterns, we need to recognize the existence of a third agreement pattern for transitive verbs, which is neither direct nor inverse. I'll call this the neutral pattern. I'll start with some brief background on Algonquian verb inflection. Two slots in the agreement inflection of transitive verbs are relevant to the discussion of direct and inverse. Consider these independent and conjunct forms from Moose Cree. The two crucial agreement slots are the theme sign, which follows the verb stem and is either an inverse marker or an object marker, and the central agreement, which is a single suffix in the conjunct and a prefix-suffix combination in the independent. I'll use the colors that you see here to distinguish these two slots in all data in this talk. Now I'll argue for the two main proposals of this talk, which are, first, that the terms direct and inverse most properly denote agreement patterns, and second, that there's an additional agreement pattern, the neutral pattern, that is neither direct nor inverse. Let's start by looking at some clear examples of direct and inverse forms in Cree. These are independent forms for 1-on-3 and 3-on-1, and 2-on-3 and 3-on-2. The key observation, which is well known, is that the agreement inflection in these pairs of forms is symmetrical and is most elegantly described with reference to a person hierarchy. The central agreement indexes the higher-ranked person, whether it's the agent, as in I see and you see, or the patient, as in sees me and sees you. This gives us pairs of opposite forms that show the same central agreement, differing only in whether the theme sign is an inverse marker or a third-person object marker, also known as a direct marker. This is a clear, coherent system, and the terms direct and inverse work well as labels for the two contrasting patterns: direct in the forms with a higher-ranked agent, and inverse in the forms with a higher-ranked patient. Let's think about how the two agreement patterns can be described. In the direct pattern, the central agreement indexes only the agent, and the theme sign indexes the patient. In the inverse pattern, the central agreement indexes only the patient, and the theme sign is a special marker that doesn't index a particular agent or patient. A further property is that the direct and inverse patterns give us opposite forms that usually differ only in the theme sign. This description is based on independent verb forms, but we also need to think about the conjunct. Here are the Cree conjunct forms for 1-on-3 and 3-on-1, and for 2-on-3 and 3-on-2. Most other Algonquian languages have similar forms. Let's think about whether these forms fit the descriptions of the direct and inverse patterns. In the direct pattern, the central agreement indexes the agent only, but in the conjunct forms, the central agreement actually indexes both arguments simultaneously, so that doesn't fit. In the inverse pattern, the central agreement indexes the patient only, but in the conjunct forms it actually indexes the agent, so that also doesn't fit. In the direct pattern, the theme sign indexes the patient, and that is the case in the conjunct forms too, so that's one point of similarity. But in the inverse pattern, the theme sign is a special inverse marker, and that's not the case in the conjunct. The theme sign indexes the patient. The direct and inverse patterns also contrast minimally, differing only in the theme sign, but that's also not the case here. The theme sign and the central agreement are both different. These forms simply don't fit the descriptions of the direct and inverse patterns. The terms direct and inverse exist because we need them to describe the special properties of certain pairs of transitive forms, like the independent forms we saw above. But in these conjunct forms, those special properties are absent, so we don't gain any insight by labeling these conjunct forms as direct and inverse. What's worse, by labeling these forms as direct and inverse, we obscure the fact that these forms actually have their own distinct morphological structure, which is neither direct nor inverse. We're imposing a theoretical concept in a place where it doesn't belong, despite being very useful elsewhere in the system. There's a relevant quote from Geoffrey Heath talking about non-Algonquian languages. He says that the term inverse should only be used to describe actual inverse morphology. If we use the term inverse even when the morphology is not actually inverse, as in the Cree conjunct forms, then we're engaging in mission creep, which will weaken and ultimately destroy the usefulness of the term. A form isn't inverse because we think it should be inverse based on the person hierarchy. It's inverse because its actual morphology has the specific properties that we label as inverse. Here's another illustration that not all forms are direct or inverse. This time we'll compare forms in Plains Cree and Moose Cree. This particular pair of Plains Cree conjunct forms clearly does show the direct and inverse patterns. The central agreement indexes the higher ranked person, whether that's the agent, as in we see, or the patient, as in sees us. And otherwise the two forms differ only in whether or not the theme sign is inverse. This is the same pattern that we find in the independent, just with different morphology. The equivalent forms in Moose Cree, however, are quite different. The central agreement indexes both arguments, rather than picking out the higher ranked one, and the inverse theme sign doesn't appear. Instead, the theme sign indexes the patient in both forms. Third person in see her, first person in sees us. It's accurate to describe the Plains Cree forms as direct and inverse, but there's no reason to do the same for Moose Cree. If we describe the Moose Cree forms as direct and inverse, we're implying that they have properties that aren't actually there. And we're also obscuring what's actually going on, because the Moose Cree forms do show a particular agreement pattern. It's just a pattern that happens to be different from the direct and inverse patterns. If we consider the Moose Cree pattern on its own, rather than trying to shoehorn it into the direct and inverse categories, what do we need to say about it? First, we're not dealing with mirror image forms here, unlike in the direct and inverse contexts. Both of the forms show the same pattern. And, unlike in the direct and inverse contexts, the pattern can be described without reference to the person hierarchy. All we need to say is that the theme sign indexes the patient, third person and first person, and the central agreement indexes both arguments, first on third and third on first. Since this pattern is neither direct nor inverse, and since it's not sensitive to the person hierarchy, I'm going to refer to it as the neutral pattern. So as an interim summary, here are the three agreement patterns that can be distinguished for transitive verbs. In the neutral pattern, the central agreement indexes both arguments, and the theme sign indexes the patient. In the direct pattern, the central agreement indexes the agent, and the theme sign indexes the patient. And in the inverse pattern, the central agreement indexes the patient, and the theme sign is a special inverse marker. One thing needs to be refined here. The patterning of central agreement in neutral forms is a bit more complicated than this description indicates. It doesn't always index both arguments. So let's now take a closer look at exactly how the neutral agreement pattern should be defined and understood. It's the central agreement that we need to focus on. The theme sign is not a problem, as it consistently indexes the patient in all neutral forms. But the central agreement can do a bunch of things. In some pairs of neutral forms, the central agreement uniformly indexes both arguments, as in the Moose Cree forms that we just looked at. Both forms have a portmanteau central suffix that indexes the agent and the patient. In other pairs of neutral forms, the central agreement indexes just one argument. In this pair, for example, the central agreement indexes the inclusive argument, regardless of whether it's the agent or the patient. This starts to feel like the same kind of hierarchy effect that we see in direct and inverse forms. And then there are pairs of neutral forms that show mixed behavior. We can see this in forms that involve second-person plural. When 2p is the agent, the central agreement indexes only 2p. But when 2p is the patient, the central agreement is a portmanteau that indexes both arguments. Whatever's going on here, it's too subtle to capture using the person hierarchy that governs the direct and inverse forms. So how exactly does central agreement work in neutral forms? I said earlier that in neutral paradigms, central agreement indexes both arguments. Let me make that a little bit more abstract. Central agreement has access to the features of both arguments. In neutral paradigms, the system doesn't inherently rule out agreement with the lower ranked argument, unlike in direct and inverse paradigms. Features of both arguments are there, ready to be spelled out, but you can only index both arguments if you have the morphology to do the job. In the conjunct, there's a small set of portmanteau central suffixes that index both arguments. So if you're dealing with a combination of arguments for which a portmanteau suffix exists, then that's what you use. But if there isn't a portmanteau suffix for a particular combination of arguments, then it seems that the fallback position is just to index whichever argument has the richest or the most specified or the most marked features. For example, imagine that the arguments are an inclusive and a third person. There don't happen to be any portmanteau suffixes for this combination, so you're going to have to index just one of the two arguments, either the inclusive or the third person. Since the inclusive has richer features, it's a speech act participant and it's plural, it's going to be the inclusive that gets indexed rather than the third person. The inclusive wins the competition to be indexed by the central suffix. And that, I suggest, is how central agreement works in neutral forms. Unlike in direct and inverse forms, there's no overarching person hierarchy that controls everything. You just spell out as many features as you can, using a portmanteau if you've got one, and otherwise favoring the argument with richer features. There is, however, an exception to the competition analysis that I just proposed. It usually works, but there's a small set of neutral forms in which the central agreement actually rigidly indexes the agent, regardless of which argument has the richer features. We can see this exception in two contexts. It happens when third acts on first or second singular. She sees me, she sees you. Here it's actually the third person agent that gets indexed by the central suffix, not the first or second person, as we might expect on grounds of featural richness. The same thing also happens when second singular and first singular interact. When 2s acts on 1s, the central suffix indexes the 2s agent, and when 1s acts on 2s, the central suffix indexes the 1s agent. Again, this can't follow from featural richness. If it did, the central suffix ought to index either the 2s argument in both forms or the 1s argument in both forms, depending on whether 2 or 1 is richer. But instead, what's happening is that you index the agent, regardless of its features. This pattern has been discussed elsewhere. The preference to index the agent is quite a surprising thing to find in Algonquian. It's unexpected from the perspective of the person hierarchy, and it also doesn't follow from competition and featural richness. However, I think there is still a morphological explanation for this exceptional pattern. The key is that in all the forms in which the central agreement shows the exceptional agent preference, the patient is either first singular or second singular, me or you. And if you think about it, the theme sign on its own suffices to fully express the features of a first or second singular patient. The theme sign tells us the person of the patient, and when the patient is singular, its person is the only feature that needs to be expressed. This wouldn't be the case for plural patients, since the theme sign doesn't express number, but it is the case for singular patients. This gives us a way to explain why it's these particular forms in which the central agreement unexpectedly shows a preference to index the agent. If the central agreement did index the patient in these forms, it would be totally redundant. The central agreement would be expressing something that is already fully expressed by the theme sign. The only way for the central agreement to contribute new information in this particular context is by indexing the agent. And that, I propose, is the reason for the agent preference that unexpectedly arises in these forms. This is not a place where the Algonquian agreement system suddenly starts caring about the syntax in a way that it never otherwise does. This is just another shallow morphological effect. There's a preference for morphology to be informative. And in this particular context, being informative means not redundantly indexing the patient, which in turn means indexing the agent. Not because the agent syntactically outranks the patient, but simply because the patient has already been fully indexed by the theme sign, so there's nothing left for the central agreement to do but index the agent. In light of that discussion, here's a slightly refined set of definitions for the three transitive agreement patterns. In the neutral pattern, the central agreement indexes one or both arguments, and the theme sign indexes the patient. The precise outcome of central agreement is determined by shallow morphological factors, which can be summarized as two principles. Spell out as many features as possible, and don't be totally redundant. In the direct and inverse patterns, the central agreement is more restricted. In the direct pattern, the central agreement only ever indexes the agent, and the theme sign indexes the patient. While in the inverse pattern, the central agreement only ever indexes the patient, and the theme sign is the special inverse marker. To my knowledge, all transitive forms in the Central and Eastern Algonquian languages fit into one of these three patterns. To conclude, I propose that the terms direct and inverse most properly refer to agreement patterns, and they should not be used simply as shorthands for particular argument combinations. To apply the term inverse to a form that's not morphologically inverse is to impose a linguistic analysis in a place where that analysis is not justified. I've also proposed that all transitive forms inflect in one of three patterns. In addition to the direct and inverse patterns, there's a third distinct pattern that I've suggested to call the neutral pattern. The takeaway here is that not all transitive forms are direct or inverse. The neutral pattern is diachronically the oldest of the three, and it shows the most flexibility and irregularity, which is perhaps the reason why other linguists haven't found it worthwhile to recognize the neutral pattern as a type of its own. But I think there is some benefit in doing this. It allows us to restrict the terms direct and inverse to their most principled senses, and it gives us a way to talk about forms that are neither direct nor inverse, recognizing the potential that these forms have structural properties of their own, rather than just being an assortment of exceptions that we relegate to footnotes. This concludes the presentation, but there's a lot more that could be said about this topic. In the PDF handout, there's an appendix that covers some further points, including a discussion of how the proposals that I've made in this presentation relate to the existing literature. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to your comments and questions.